under different categories, from Cat 1 all the way to Cat 7, even nowadays Cat 8. Each and every one of these having uh, different capabilities in terms of transfer rate and in terms of um, um, in terms of um, um, bandwidth, essentially. All right. Um, um, we also were sort of like alluding to the fact that these twisted pair cables tend to be connected together using what are known as RJ45 connectors, all right, or um, RJ jack RJ45 jacks, all right, which are usually sorted in this particular configuration in order to be able um, uh, to um, uh, to communicate across all 8 wires. They come in different colors. All right, so you have the orange pair, the green pair, the blue pair, and the brown pair. All right, and each pair has a cable which is both white and that color. So white and blue, white and green, white and orange, and white and brown. Okay. Um, uh, Normally, the unshielded twisted pair cables, those are used for patch leads, all right, as we had mentioned last time. However, the shielded cables tend to be used predominantly um, to to set up an infrastructure. All right, for the simple reason that shielded twisted pair cables are very, very, very similar to uh, twisted unshielded twisted pair cables. However, they are they are by far more robust and therefore can withstand elements of interference. They can also um, um, withstand any form of crosstalk that might happen. All right, and they're usually used in order to set up these infrastructures. Just to let you know, as an example, in my house here, I tended to use the unshielded twisted pair cable in order to pass cables along my wall channels, essentially. So the jacks that I have in place around my home are shielded twisted pair cables. All right. Whereas the what is everything? All right. Yes. Floyd just joined in. Whereas the normal patch leads, those don't need to, in essence, be um, uh, they do not need to be um, uh, oh, that they don't need to be that robust, and therefore I didn't need to make them shielded. Used shield cable. The shielded pair communication cable is usually is set as a standard. Guys, can you hear me?
Now, yes, because something was wrong, I think.
Right. Um, uh, up to which point did you hear me?
Shielded cable.
Excuse me?
You were talking about the shielded cable that you pass through the.
Ah,
Uh,
okay. So it cut out a while ago. Okay. Um, uh, my internet seems to be playing up a little bit. Um, uh, would you mind if I just share my screen and not my camera, just to help it along?
No problem.
All right. So, what I was saying is that with well, view full screen with the shielded twisted pair, the fact that they are not as flexible means that they become very unusable when it comes to patch leads, especially when you're trying to patch or connect items which are relatively in close proximity. Okay, so therefore they are used in situations where you don't need to constantly bend them, and that's why placing them in wall installations, all right, for jack point, all right, for data jack point, is um, uh, an ideal use case scenario for a shielded twisted pair cable. Obviously, shielded twisted pairs also have the added advantages for the simple fact that they are shielded, i.e., they are less prone to be influenced by interference from outside sources. And as you can imagine, in households and in offices and what have you, you might have also other power cables passing alongside these data cables, which could, in theory, influence and affect these the performances of these cables. All right. So far, so good. Did everybody manage to catch that?
Yep.
yep, thank you.
Okay. Um, what I was also saying is that usually the shielded twisted pair cable is usually used in order to set up um, the uh, the infrastructure even of of certain network topologies such as the ring token topology um, or any other form of topology whereby you're going to put in place an infrastructure which doesn't really need to be changed that often. Again, since cables are bulky and not really that suitable for numerous bends. All right, it's important that you make sure that you take easy bends. All right, so that as to not break the cable along along your line of communication. Okay. Right. The next form of cable that we're going to be talking about is the fiber optic cable. This is one of the more recent innovations in terms of um, um, cable, all right, that is used for electronic communication, all right. Essentially, a glass fiber cable has a glass core, all right, with a number of filaments, all right, of glass fibers going through um, the center wire, and the main medium that they use in order to transmit signals is through the use of light. All right, whereas the um, um, whereas the shielded twisted pair cables and the coaxial cable that we had talked about earlier made use of electrons literally flowing through a copper core. Okay, fiber optic cables make use of light in order to transmit their signal. The fantastic thing about fiber optic cables is that they are less prone to be influenced by any form of electrical interference. They also travel a lot farther, all right, than traditional copper cabling, all right, and obviously at greater speeds because we're talking here about the speed of light. And you also have more bandwidth for the same width of cable. You're going to be able to cater for a larger bandwidth. Okay. In fact, um, um, they are the cable of choice, if you will, even with regards um, uh, to internet infrastructures, all right, of ISPs, in order to be able to transmit vast quantities of data, all right, to and from their servers and um, their clients, essentially. All right. The cool thing about fiber optic cables is um, that they are so they're they are so well adapted in order to be able to handle um, the larger bandwidths that on a single cable of the same dimension, essentially, that you would have for any other form of cable that we've discussed up to this point, you would be able to transmit tens, if not hundreds of times more data, all right, across that same cross-sectional area, if you will. That is one of the reasons why um, fiber optic cables is becoming more and more sought after as the go-to technology, all right, in order to transmit data, all right, via cable over a distance. The problem with fiber optic cables is that um, they they if the fibers or the glass fibers break inside the cable, then essentially you're going to lose the connection. All right, it's not just a simple um, um, a simple matter um, um, of having physical contact, because in this case, what you really want is light reflections to actually arrive at your destination, because what you are literally transferring is the light itself. All right, it's like breaking a mirror. You know, the mirror wouldn't really um, remain as effective as a device in order to um, reflect light, and in the same way, all right, this cable wouldn't be able to reflect the light which is carrying the data. But in order to protect these cables, all right, what these cables usually have is, first and foremost, they have either a PVC, which is essentially a plastic, or a Teflon coating. All right, and above that, you will also have a Kevlar fiber. Essentially, Kevlar is the type of fiber that is used in body armor um, uh, for bulletproof vests. You know, essentially, the idea is in order to prevent the cable from breaking by strengthening, all right, the coating, all right, and then over above that you will have yet another plastic coating in order to cushion the fiber itself, and at the center you would have your glass core. Sometimes it's also a plastic core, all right, but usually it is made up of glass, all right. Now, the fiber optic connectors are very, very similar to the type of connectors that we had seen for the coaxial cable, essentially. All right, so the BCN connection. In reality, I don't know if any of you actually have this installed maybe in your own home. Some televisions, for example, have what is known as an optical out, which is used in order to communicate with, for example, your sound system or something of the sort. Um, uh, Essentially, nowadays, what we use is the AUI connector, which kind of looks like this. Let me just show you. So, AUI connector. Sorry, not this AUI connector. This is a connector which is used in order to be able to plug in um, to a fiber optic cable without without having actual fiber optic input. This is basically what the fiber optic cables tends to make use of. All right, there are these SC connectors. All right, notice that they are squarish in their makeup in order to make it easier in order to plug in. All right, so that you don't actually have um, uh, you don't actually have many different ways as to how a cable can actually be placed into the connector, and it also locks, therefore ensuring the connection. Earlier versions of this type of connector were rounded. Okay. In fact, these were the different types of connectors that were used for fiber optic cabling. As you can see, the earlier versions, all right, were the FC connectors, all right, were circular. But they didn't actually have this locking mechanism that the SC connectors provide. But nowadays, this is pretty much the standard that is used for fiber optic connections. So, we talked about wired connections. What about wireless connections? In our case, we're going to start off by talking a little bit about Bluetooth. All right. So, Bluetooth, in essence, is a radio system. All right, that is going to allow you to communicate. All right, between one device and another. All right, it was first introduced by uh, Ericsson and Intel and IBM and Nokia and Toshiba in 1998, and this protocol was used in order to be able to make different mobile devices communicate with one another for in very short distances. In fact, they invented the idea of the personal area network, and the whole scope behind it was to replace and remove as many cables as possible. All right. Any questions so far? I think I heard somebody who was um, trying to ask a question at some point.
I'm okay.
I'm okay as well, thank you.
Okay. So, um, when it comes to Bluetooth, all right, as you can imagine, there are a number of solutions that are available to one. All right, you can have Bluetooth inbuilt into your system nowadays. It's so widespread, but if not, you can actually have Bluetooth dongles, which can be connected via USB. All right, and they can be used in order to control a host of different types of devices, from headphones to earbuds to mice to keyboards. All right, but even other things. All right, such as watches, sunglasses, prosthetics. All right, a lot of different types of devices can be used in order to make use of the Bluetooth system in order to communicate with one another. And over here we can see a number of different applications of Bluetooth. I would suggest that you take a look at them. I'm quite quite sure that you're aware of most of these different types of devices. All right, in order to help you out. All right, and be a bit more aware about the different applications of Bluetooth. Okay, thank you, Gavin. Glad you could join us. Right. So, Bluetooth predominantly can work on what is known as the 2.45 gigahertz band, all right, which is unlicensed and is available globally, all right, except for a few exceptions, especially Japan, France, and Spain. However, having said that, there are different versions of Bluetooth that do exist. They just use different frequencies in those countries, essentially. And Bluetooth nowadays can actually fit on very, very, very small chips. The a typical Bluetooth chip can basically take up the size of 7 millimeters by 8 millimeters, essentially in size. But nowadays they're actually getting smaller. But the cool thing behind Bluetooth is that it uses what is known as a frequency hopping spread spectrum. Have you ever wondered as to why, all right, you need to pair your device, your Bluetooth device, with your phone every time you want to make use of it for the very first time? Why you need to pair your phone with your car, for example, why you need to pair your smartwatch with your phone, and so on and so forth. Have you ever wondered why that is the case?
I have
always,
wondered,
not
but
really. No.
I always thought
I
it
have
was for
wondered, but
security.
yes, I was going to say exactly the same. That it was for security.
Yes, it is for security, but it's also to make better use of the Bluetooth spectrum, all right, of frequencies, um, and therefore allow for more Bluetooth signals to happen simultaneously without much interference. Okay. Um, so it is for security reasons as well as for quality of service reasons. Okay. So essentially, what happens is um, you take the frequency, the band of frequencies that Bluetooth operates in. All right. So essentially, it is from 2004 2.4 gigahertz to 2.48 gigahertz, and you split that up. All right, in 1 megahertz intervals. All right, so between 2.4 and 2.48. All right, there happens to be 79 different hops. Okay. Now, based upon the number, all right, that is used in order to pair a device with another device, okay, that number basically is used as a sort of confirmation between the two devices as to the order in which data is actually going to be sent across that's duration of their communication. So just for us to be a bit more aware, huh? If I just open up my, okay, that's fine, but I want the tablet itself. Where is it? There you go. Whiteboard. So we would have two devices. So let's say we have our phone, all right? And over here we'll have our computer. So our PC, all right? And they agree that they're using this pin in order to communicate with. This number essentially allows, all right, these two devices to know the order with which these the packets of data are actually going to be sent. All right, so if we had to plot, all right, frequency, all right, across time, okay, let me split up these time units into blocks, okay. So probably it would be best if I actually drew these lines like so. Okay, and over here we have our frequencies. All right, I'm taking a little bit of a shortcut. I'm not going to draw them all, but at least you'll get the idea. So essentially, with this grid, what do I have? So let's talk about these as being time unit 1, time unit 2, time unit 3, time unit 4, 5, etc., until time unit n. Whereas over here we'll have 2.40 gigahertz, 2.401 gigahertz, 2.402 gigahertz, all right, and so on and so forth until 2.48 gigahertz, all right. So essentially, let's say this device is going to send send data, all right, from the phone to the computer, all right. Based upon this number, all right, remember, okay, what is going to happen is that the frequency over time, all right, is going to be synchronized between the two devices. So let's say that this phone at time unit 1 will send the its data on this frequency. Then at time unit 2, it will send it on, say, this frequency. All right. At time unit 3, it will send it on this frequency. All right. And time unit 4, it might send it here. Time unit 5, it might send it back down here. And at time unit n, maybe it will send it over here. All right. So essentially, what is being agreed upon between these two devices is the sequence as to which frequency is going to be used at any given point in time. So they have to be sort of synchronized. Okay? This is why it's known as a frequency hopping spectrum. All right? Signal spectrum. All right? The cool thing about it is that essentially different devices, all right, can use the same 71 or 79 frequency bands, all right, and send data to one another in exactly the same way. Okay. Now, it could be the case, all right, that a device for a particular time unit might be sending on the same channel as another device. All right. Um, but that short blip um, in the communication is not going to affect the overall quality of service. Essentially, the reason why this is both quality of service um, quality of service approach as well as a as well as a security approach. Okay, is because in order to make sense of the data that is actually coming in, all right, you need to know as to about the signal that is coming in at any given point in time from that particular device. Does that make sense?
Can you repeat that, please, sir?
Mana, in order to be able to make sense of the signal, all right, it's impossible to be able to actually read all of the packets that are actually being transmitted across the entire frequency spectrum, all right, and trying to reassemble the message, by knowing when the packet of data has actually been transmitted and received by these two devices. You would be able to reassemble it at the other end, and therefore it will allow for security. It also allows for quality of service because it allows multiple devices, all right, to make use of the same frequency spectrum, all right, at the same time. As you can say, technically speaking, it can make use of 79 different communication um, channels at the same time. However, remember that Bluetooth have a very, very short range. In fact, the typical range of Bluetooth spectrum is between 10 centimeters to 10 meters. All right. Sometimes it can also be extended a little bit more to, say, 100 meters. All right. However, sometimes um, uh, extending extending the range might decrease your transmittability. So it is not always going to be the case that it's going to be ideal. However, you can have high-powered um, Bluetooth systems, which also would have relatively high um, high bandwidth. However, you need to make sure that you have a good line of sight, essentially, between the two devices in order to reduce the amount of problems. For example, here at home, I have a number of very, very thick walls, and if I have a device in one room, all right, and I say my phone is in one room, and I am wearing Bluetooth earphones, and I'm walking around doing, God knows whatever, maybe cleaning or something of the sort. If I walk to another room, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm actually going to be able to listen continuously what what I was listening to earlier. I would have to go retrieve the phone and so on and so forth. But that is essentially what goes on within Bluetooth. All right. Any questions with regards to this?
Oh, it's fine now. Thank you.
Okay. So as we can see, all right, with Bluetooth you can actually create a small network, right, which is known as essentially as a piconet, all right, between multiple devices, all right, which are in range with one another. Okay. So, having talked a little bit about the different types of connections that we might face, let's talk a little bit about scale. All right, as we've seen, all right, different types of networks, all right, can be classified depending on how big they are. All right, we have the LAN, which is for a local area network, WAN for wide area network, MAN for metropolitan area network, the PAN, which we've just seen, all right, the personal area network, CAN, campus area network, and many, many others. Again, most of them depend on their scale, on their scope, and on their purpose. Okay? And they usually have a number of approximate ranges, and most of them sort of tends to overlap one from another. All right, as you can see over here, we have our small area networks, which sort of overlaps on our personal area networks and our local area networks, and a little bit of our metropolitan area network, depending on what you mean by small, really and truly. All right, these terms are very, very, very fluid in their use. However, they generally have a broad understanding of the type of networks that you're currently talking about. All right. So when we talk about personal area network, we're really and truly talking about devices which are in pretty much touching distance to that one person. All right. So we're essentially talking about having a phone or a PDA, communicating with a computer or a laptop. All right, with a printer, with scanners. All right. Sometimes even with game consoles and controllers. In order to be able to communicate within a relatively short distance. All right. Notice personal area networks can also be wired. All right. So it doesn't necessarily have to be wireless. All right. So anything which is sort of like connected up using a USB or a firewire cable is essentially also connected to a network, technically speaking. So even if you have a wired keyboard and a wired mouse, that is still part of a network, essentially, of different devices being connected with one another. All right. However, obviously, you do have the idea of the wireless personal area network, like we said, with Bluetooth. All right. Moving up a bit of a notch, we also have what is known as the home area network. Right, the home area network is essentially the local area network that is used in a residential setting. So essentially, here we're talking about the idea between different devices being connected together. All right, from personal computers to mobile phones to printers and stuff like that within the home, even nowadays, with regards to, say, for instance, TVs and digital the digital subscriber lines. These are all part of what we call the home area network, and usually they're lumped in together with the local area network element. All right. So here's a typical local area network setup where you'd basically have the internet connection passing through a firewall, which might be on your modem as well, which in turn is fed into your switch or your router, and that in turn is connected to all of your other devices that you might have in home at your home in order to be able to communicate with these devices. Notice that even though the slide does say my home area network, this is not my home network diagram. But anyway, just saying. Okay. um, uh, so essentially, the home area network and the local area network, they're essentially they are typically lumped together, all right, in terms of size. However, usually local area networks are reserved for those or those networks which are a bit larger in scope, however still limited to a relatively small area. Okay. Usually local area networks can be used in ideas for the home, but they're more typically used for schools and library of computers, all right, office buildings, all right, and sometimes even privately owned businesses, all right. Essentially, the whole idea behind the local area network that each device represents its own node, all right, and you have any one of those topologies that we already discussed earlier, all right, being set up in order to allow communication from one node to any other node on that same network, essentially. And usually, these kinds of networks have a very high transfer rate. Okay, so here's an example of a typical local area network. Again, the internet coming in through a corporate firewall into your into your modem, which in turn is split up over three routers or three switches, and then you have your computers connected to those switches. All right. Again, the idea so that you have very high transfer rates between each and every one of these nodes, all right? And you would group computers that would tend to communicate more with each other on the same section, right? In order not to clutter up the main backbone, if you will, of the network. Okay? Campus area networks are usually networks which are reserved in order to differentiate between the local area networks, which might be implemented in certain buildings and in certain offices, as opposed to groups of buildings which form a campus, essentially. All right. Usually, these kinds of networks are set up in universities or in in some form of large institution where you have multiple buildings that needs to be interconnected to each other, all right, so that there is actually good connectivity between the buildings itself, all right. So with regards to say a university campus, all right, it is probably likely that you would have different buildings, all right? So you'd have an administrative building, you might have an academic building, you might have libraries, you might have buildings with lecture theaters and so on and so forth. And somehow you would need to connect all of these different buildings up together. If you take, for instance, the University of Malta, the University of Malta is made up of a number of different buildings, and all of them need to have access, all right, or need at least to provide access. All right. So what you would technically tend to do is you would set up an infrastructure between each and every one of these buildings, all right, across the campus, and then you would use smaller local area networks within the buildings in order to connect to the building infrastructure. All right. Other examples of campus area networks include the Googleplex, which is basically the headquarters of Google, all right, where obviously Google has its own campus as well, all right. Normally, campus networks tend to operate with high speed, um, uh, fiber optic cables from one building to the other in order to not sacrifice on speed and bandwidth, essentially. All right. Even at St. Martin's, there is a fiber optic cable linking um, the new building with the foundation building. All right. So even with our limited campus, all right, we do have a similar infrastructure put in place. So essentially, your backbone will be your fiber optic cable, which is basically where you're going to be connecting your internet connection to, and you'll connect each building up to that backbone, and then have your whoops each building having its own local area network set up inside. All right. Any questions with regards to what we've just discussed here?
Yes, maybe we could go over the intermediate infrastructures because it wasn't exactly clear to me how you could hook up a campus of buildings together.
So what you would have
Mm.
is so you would have devices, all right, which can accept essentially your fiber optic connection. That is what is going to be basically um, uh, what is going to allow you to connect from one device, all right, or rather one building to another building to another building. Okay, does that make sense?
Yep.
Then those devices themselves will in turn feed intermediary devices, all right, within the building itself, all right, and they would have basically load distribution set up across these devices, so that if you have three laboratories, all right, in one building, for example, and one laboratory is making massive use or it requires higher transfer rate, you would not overload one device, but you would make use of maybe two or three devices to cater for that particular laboratory's needs, if you know what I mean. Okay,
Yes.
and then obviously you would have your individual local area networks, all right, which would supply the computers in the physical rooms, essentially. Okay, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Bit better, yes. So, but we're still ultimately going down to switches, routers, and
Yes, of
such.
course,
Okay.
but you'd have different switches or different routers which have different capabilities. As you can imagine, all right, um, uh, I can purchase if I wanted to, all right, a a cheap and cheerful um, uh, four port router, you know. But a four port router doesn't have the capabilities of, say, an 8-port router or a 24-port router, or even larger, an even larger system. You know what I'm saying? So essentially, the different devices will allow for different uh,
Scaling.
functionality, even within routers themselves. I mean, if you look at even the what is available at, say, people like Scan or Schnafian, hashtag not an advert, you would be able to see that you would have different routers which have varying different price points. All right, even though that they can cater for the same number of devices connected to them. Why is that? Well, you might have certain routers which have faster processors on their on board, therefore they would be able to handle higher volumes of data. You know, you might have routers which have more options for interconnectivity. You might have routers which have the ability to make use of what is known as link aggregation. All right. Um, uh, the idea of link aggregation essentially is the option to be able to use um, uh, to think of a dual link. All right. So two cables together, for example, to be seen as though it is one link. All right. So therefore, you'll be able to split up the high volume of traffic on two cables rather than one. Right. That is an example of link aggregation. I talked about um, uh, two cables essentially being used for link aggregation, but you can have multiple, you can have 4, 6, 8, 12 cables used for link aggregation, obviously depending on the amount of traffic that you're going to be expecting between these different buildings. I don't know if that helps your.
Yes, so that's perfect. So it still boils down to like the fundamental stuff that I knew, routers, switches, etc. But there are more of them in different types and different capabilities, and you can
Exactly,
scale
exactly.
you can, type.
All right. So
Yeah.
you obviously um, uh, it's pointless to be able to actually go through each and individual device, because by the time uh, we talk about a particular device, some other device might have come along which has better features. Essentially they're still called a router, they're still called a switch. They just have different capabilities. You know.
Yeah, I remember. I think like 10 years ago or so, there was the N Plus, which was like the latest wireless frequency, and it was like both.
Nowadays you have Wi-Fi 6, for example,
Okay.
which is one of the better technology, because Wi-Fi 6 allows you to have is first and foremost faster transfer rates, and it also one of the major advancements that has actually happened in the past few years, I would say, is the innovation of AI meshes, essentially. All right, and this is particularly useful um, uh, when it comes to devices that are being that are connecting um, uh, to a Wi-Fi network. All right, and you are moving that wireless device from one room to the next. All right. The problem is that whenever you are connecting to a network, essentially what you're doing is you're connecting to a device. All right. The device will basically say, I have so many different um, different IP addresses that I can allocate, all right, which is what we know as a DHCP server, all right. I'm going to allocate you this particular IP address, and you'll be able to communicate with me. However, if you're moving from one room to another, all right, essentially what tends to happen is that your device will try to retain connection with the original device that you connected with, all right, even though you might have moved on to another room, all right, you're closer to another access point, for example, and so on and so forth. And that access point also has a wired connection direct to the modem, and therefore, if you connect to it, you're going to have a faster connection. But your device will think that it should try to retain that connection, all right? And with AI meshes, essentially, what you would have is these different DHCP servers, all right, or these different access points connected together, and they act as though they are one, and they would act intelligently. And they say, um, uh, if this node, all right, or this access point is going to provide a better quality of service to this device, then it's going to act as the DHCP server, not the other one. That is one of the major technologies that has been implemented recently and is now being disseminated um, uh, to the home local area networks. I mean, if you see any advert provided by Go or Melita, when they say internet in any room, essentially what they're offering is this idea of an AI mesh system, really.
Is it based on distance, you said, between from one router to the next?
It's not necessarily distance. Distance is usually the main contributor, but you might have a stronger signal with a device which is actually farther away. So, for example, you might live in a building which has a lot of concrete and therefore metal bars in the building itself, to hold up the concrete essentially. But those metal bars provide a lot of interference, even if you have a lot of gypsum walls. Gypsum walls are fastened together using predominantly steel structures behind them. Even if they're relatively thin and flimsy, but it's still steel structures. But these steel structures, these steel cages, essentially end up acting as a Faraday cage, which block a lot of these radio signals. So it could be the case that in one you might be as the crow flies, you would be closer to a router or an access point, but you would have direct line of sight to another. But that direct line of sight means that you have a better quality of service because the other one has to sort of like pass through a wall or something of the sort. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, I've experienced it a lot. Actually, I used to be able to hook up to my house from about 100 kilometers away because it was next to the window, and I could go shopping and use my Wi-Fi. But then if you go to the kitchen, that's it. It's gone.
Ah,
So it's signal as opposed to distance.
it's about
Well,
signal.
I mean, that's why it's AI. Probably it's an algorithm that factors in a lot of stuff, and then
How?
well,
Usually, what happens is that you would buy devices that tend to act on their own. So if you buy a router, um, uh, and then you say, "Damn it, I need to have another router here in order to be able to cater for these other devices that I have in this other room, etc., etc., etc." They would up to very recently, they used to act completely independently from one another. All right. The only saving grace is that at least between those two devices, you actually probably would have had a physical connection, and therefore you would have sped up your internet speed. You know what I mean? But but if they are working completely separate from one another, then they weren't actually making sure that you're actually getting the best signal all the time. Um, uh, so what these new AI mesh systems do is that they sort of like trick your device, all right, that is actually connecting to it, to think that the device that they're actually connected to, all right, forms part of all of those other devices, um, uh, those other devices that you have connected as your network backbone, essentially. Um, uh, so in that case, it will also not only make your connection a lot faster, but with regards to, say, battery powered devices like mobile phones and laptops, they would tend to use less power as well, because once they lose a connection, all right, or they're trying to communicate with a device with a very weak signal, they're actually making use of a lot more power than, say, if they were connecting to a device with with a higher signal, because it's easier. It's kind of like saying, what is it? In which road is it easier to drive really fast down? All right, a six-lane highway or a single-lane road. Probably it's the six-lane highway. Obviously, depending on the traffic situations that you're encountering. But the same thing happens with wireless signals as well. Essentially, you understand?
Yes. Thank you.
All right. So, right. So that basically covers the campus area network model. The moving on to a bit more of a larger scale, you have what is known as the metropolitan area network. As we said, usually the metropolitan area network is a network that is used in order to be able to connect several blocks of buildings, all right, and sometimes even entire cities, all right, together. All right, and this is usually what is adopted by most internet service providers. All right, so if we actually take a little bit of a look at this diagram, all right, you would have a number of different households. All right, so you have a number of these buildings, all connected to the same junction box. All right, in fact, whenever you buy a service, all right, with whomever ISP you want, you're always going to have, all right, a shared junction box, all right, unless you pay over the odds for a direct connection. Essentially, a direct connection. Let's say this house wants a direct connection, will need to pay for the infrastructure in order to connect directly to the infrastructure provided um, uh, by that ISP. All right. Obviously, having a direct connection means that you have a more guaranteed quality of service. However, with internet speeds becoming more and more or increasingly fast, the idea of quality of service is not really that much of an issue, because not every household is going to make use of the full bandwidth that is actually catered for in this metropolitan area network at any given point in time. All right. So usually, what you would have is you would have 4 or 5 different. In Malta, we tend to have 4 or 5 different households, sort of like connected to one junction box. All right, you'd probably have noticed them in and around our streets. All right. Um, Again, you would have the number of junction boxes usually is determined by the type of building. Sometimes you might have a junction box for just one building. All right, especially when it comes to flats. All right, and complexes with multiple households there. Um, and these in turn would be used to feed directly to the head, or to a main server. All right, which allows for internet connection and sometimes also with regards to television services, all right, and telephone services, to be quite honest. So essentially, that is what happens now. Usually, when you are well, when your internet service tends to sort of like play up, it's usually because um, these junction boxes might not have been well maintained, and therefore you might have corrosion. Therefore, that makes your signal drop, um, etc., etc., etc. To Paul, and you might have that's why you would also have several areas, for example, which might have lower internet speeds than others, because in some areas, let's say, for instance, these two areas might have fiber optic installed, all right, because obviously you actually need to physically change the infrastructure in order to be able to communicate with fiber optic. And let's say this area over here is making use of a copper connection, right? That's another limiting factor, um, uh, which sort of like limits the quality and the service that you might actually get at the end from the end user. Um, uh, it's also worth mentioning that since these metropolitan area networks are usually owned, all right, by the internet service providers, then it tends to be their job and their responsibility to keep and maintain these services. And to be quite frank, about they have a vested interest in order to keep their quality and their infrastructure as up to date as humanly possible. Because obviously, um, uh, like with anything else, all right, if we live in a consumer society, and if you um, uh, lose the faith of the populace, right, they would find a way to go to another internet service provider. The problem why it is not as um, not that prevalent here in Malta is because Malta is relatively a small market. All right. Even though we only have maybe 3 or 4 major internet service providers, for the size of the populace that we have here in Malta, the customer base is relatively small, and therefore it takes them a bit longer than it would to it will take them a bit longer to finish off their their upgrades, essentially. All right, and that leads us on to our wide area networks. Usually, wide area networks tend to cover entire cities or countries, all right, and in turn span bigger distances. All right, so we're talking here intercontinental distances. All right. The these types of connections are usually happen through um, communication carriers such as with satellite or with under or transatlantic cabling, to or trans um, or cables, underwater cables, in order to ensure connectivity. All right. Again, the idea is in order to be able to connect different networks together, and therefore establishing faster and better ways of communication with computers across these other locations. Any questions so far, guys?
All good, thank you.
Okay. So, right, we already talked about this. So essentially, the idea of the wide area network is to be able to connect multiple local area networks together. All right. So therefore, you would actually have the capability of communicating. All right. Well, one computer on one network with another computer on a vastly different network. All right. So we've talked about connection method, we've talked about scale. Let's talk a little bit more now about architecture and topology, and that would lead us to our next set of slides. So view full screen mode. Right. So when we talk about network architecture, essentially what we're talking about is the way that we classify networks according to their functionality, as in how they actually work together and how different elements communicate on that particular network. All right. Now, um, there are different types of networks. All right. One network that we're actually going to be talking about is the broadcast network. All right. We're also going to be understanding the difference between the broadcast network and its complete counterpart being the point-to-point network. So the broadcast network essentially has a situation whereby you have a single communication channel that is shared across all of the machines that happen to be on that network. Packets are sent out to that communication channel, all right? And technically speaking, all of those other machines will be able to receive that message at the same time, all right? However, what you could do, all right, with these broadcast networks is that in the packets that you're actually sending out, you will also include an address, all right, for the intended target, all right. And essentially, what would happen is that each device would internally check to see whether or not that packet of data is intended for it. If not, they would ignore it. All right. And that will give us the opportunity of being able um, uh, to receive information, all right, which is seemingly directed over a broadcast network. Okay. You could also have um, uh, a system whereby the same medium is broadcasting to a number of different subsets of machines. This is known as multicasting. All right, and a good example of this type uh, of system is essentially the Wi-Fi system. All right, the Wi-Fi system that is used in our everyday lives, all right, uses a broadcasting system. Essentially, your router, all right, your Wi-Fi router acts as a broadcast signal, it is broadcasting signals, all right, indiscriminately in all directions in order to reach the device that actually requests that particular information, or in order to reach that device which that packet, that information needs to be received. Essentially, all of the devices that are connected to that wireless system um, uh, would essentially ignore the packets that are not meant for it, and the device that would require that particular packet will receive it and then do whatever it needs to do with it. All right. Nowadays, you can also have systems which are communicating on different channels. So you might have routers which are operating on the 2.4 gigahertz band and the 5 gigahertz band, for example. You might have a device which is communicating 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, and as well as guest networks. All right, that is essentially known as a multicasting system. All right, so um, uh, that is essentially the way that it works. This is why, again, it is said that it less secure to work with a wireless network than it is to work with a wired network. Um, uh, this is why you might find people who rightly say that it is not a good idea to make use of um, uh, public wireless networks in order to perform, say, sensitive transactions, because you don't know who is actually receiving these packets, these signals. Technically speaking, if somebody has a special piece of software installed under the computer which can analyze and track all of the packets, all right, that is actually being transmitted on a local area network, they would be able to, or they could um, uh, use that in order um, uh, to decipher what is actually being said across different systems. This is why, again, people would tend to resort to using encryption when communicating, even through the use of VPNs, all right, virtual private networks, as we're going to be discussing in a moment. Okay. Any questions so far, guys?
Nope.
I'm okay.
All right. So, yes, yes, no. When you're connected with a wire, essentially, your router is keeping different lists. It's keeping a list of wired connections that it has, all right, and their IP and the IPs of those devices that it actually are connected directly via wire, and it also has a list of devices which are connected to it wirelessly. All right. If the packet that needs to be sent to a particular device happens to be on a wired network, then essentially what it would do is that it would use the wired system, and it would travel directly to your computer, assuming that it is a straight link. If it's not a straight link, then it might hop between a number of different devices until it actually eventually reaches your system. In that case, all right, anybody, your data, technically speaking, is traversing um, these different nodes or switches, all right, which could, in theory, um, be um, uh, be tampered with, in the sense that people could act as sort of like man in the middle. They would act as um, as a forwarding node, if you know what I mean, in order to intercept certain data. You know, um, uh, but um, uh, but obviously you would need to have physical access to that same network. All right, this is why um, uh, they will also tell you, rightly so, that your ISPs will know what you are doing with your internet history, technically speaking. Because essentially all of your internet activities is passing through your ISPs um, and through their servers. And technically speaking, they can make they can see what your internet activity is at all times, unless again it is encrypted or secured. All right. But if your router then needs to send a packet out wirelessly, all right, or to a device which is connected wirelessly, then essentially that is when that packet is broadcast, all right, not the other way around. So essentially, this is the way that it would work. Okay, hope that helps. Okay, so essentially we talked about a broadcast network. What about a point-to-point network? A point-to-point network is a network whereby you would have many connections between individual pairs of machines. Essentially, the idea is of a point-to-point network is that if you want to send data to from one device to another device, all right, on that network, all right, um, uh, you would send it along a path. However, it may um, uh, encounter many intermediate devices along the way. Okay, so for example, if you have a router, all right, and you're trying to send and you're connected to it wired in a wired fashion, all right, and you have two laptops which are connected to that router, okay, then essentially any data that is being sent from laptop A to laptop B, all right, needs to pass through that router. If you have multiple stages along in your network, then it might actually need to go from one device to the next, essentially. Okay? Notice that it might also not always be the case that every packet will follow the same path. All right? It's kind of like saying um, people traveling in cars, all right, from point A to point B, all right. Um, uh, Imagine you have, I don't know, a warehouse, all right, that needs to deliver a number of different truckloads to a shop, right, or to a retail outlet. These trucks, all right, might leave that same source and needs to arrive at the same destination, but they may take different routes, all right. And notice that not every route is going to be the most efficient, all right. So you might get certain packets which are sent down one route. Other packages are sent down another route, and other packets get sent down another route. And each and every one of these would have been um, uh, chosen for some reason or another. All right, but it's not always in terms of speed or um, uh, in terms of arrival time or something of the sort. It depends on the situation of each sort of like intermediate nodes that they might have arrived at any given point in time, essentially. Okay, so essentially, with these point-to-point networks, all right, what you also end up uh, doing, all right, is you might want to set up a system where you would have what is known as a unicasting system. What do we mean by this? You might have a situation whereby you have a device that you know is going to be the sole sender, and you're going to have another device which is going to be a sole receiver. So in that case, all right, what you could do in order to again speed up the process, all right, of transmission is that you would have a unicasting system, all right, from the sender to the receiver to a certain extent, all right, for this type of system used to happen very much so with regards to IPTV without catch up, essentially. Without catch up, all right. The IPTV system is essentially a unicasting system. So you'd have the only thing that you would have is you'd set the station that you actually want to receive from, and the sender, in this case, your television provider, will be sending data, all right, to your decoder, which is connected to your television, in order to be able to watch the program that you have selected, essentially. All right. With the advent of catch-up TV nowadays, this is a bit more complicated because obviously now you no longer have a unicasting system. But when it comes to live television, all right, probably you would switch to a unicasting system in order to speed up communication, essentially. Notice, all right, when I said that devices or packets might actually take different routes, that is usually down to the routing algorithms that are implemented on each and every one of these intermediate devices. All right. And this is one of the main reasons why routing algorithms are very, 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 very important in order um, to help um, uh, with speed and efficiency within communication. Essentially, if you think of a routing algorithm as something like having um, a road network that it works efficiently, it's very, very similar. All right, right. There are also networks which are known as ad hoc networks. What do you think the term ad hoc means?
The
Ad hoc.
voice is
Something
connected.
confusing.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. One at a time. No, no. Let's hear it from you. Kenneth, did you say something? Sorry.
I was going to say, as far as I know, ad hoc is when either a network is created for a particular circumstance only to be used for that particular instance, and then it would be subsequently dismantled.
Exactly. It's essentially a network that is put into place for a temporary amount of time. All right. That is essentially what an ad hoc network is all about. So essentially, you wouldn't have necessarily a a rigid infrastructure that you might normally see in other networks. All right, usually within an ad hoc network. All right, each device that is connected um, uh, to that network would act as um, both as a destination in and of itself as well as a resender, if you will. Okay, so essentially, you what um, can happen is that you can create a local area network with devices all connected to each other without the need of the router, if you will. All right. Normally, if you think about a local area network, you would probably need to think of a router or a switch, which allows for one device to be connected to another device. All right. In an ad hoc system, all right, you would essentially have, all right, devices connected to each other. All right, and they would also act as sort of like um, um, go betweens in order to aid the communication between one device and the next. Usually, these kinds of ad hoc systems work in a wireless environment. Okay, so you might have multiple devices connected to each other, like we can see over here, and data can literally transfer between one device and the next without actually the need of a dedicated system. Your phones have this capability all the time. I mean, you can use your devices to act as um, uh, routers, all right, or as wireless hotspots, all right. You could communicate between devices not only via wireless the Wi-Fi channels, but you could also use Bluetooth channels and NFC channels in order, again, to aid the communication between these devices. Once the communication is over, then essentially you could um, uh, remove that connection, and or the ad hoc system um, will no longer exist, essentially, or at least no longer exist for that particular time. Okay, right. Let's talk a little bit about internet working. Okay, so what we mean by the term internet working. Internet working is essentially the practice of being able to connect one computer network with another, all right, through the use of gateways. Essentially, a gateway, all right. What we understand as a gateway is essentially um, modem, all right. So in our case, all right, we are connected to each other, all right, through our networks that we have in our homes or offices or whatever. Okay, which in turn are connected to our routers, which in turn are connected to our ISPs, and therefore we are connected to each other. All right, through the gateways, which are the modems, which are the junction boxes that we've talked about. All right, and just a few moments ago via our ISPs. Each and every one of those stages, all right, between one network and the next is known as a gateway. All right, essentially, a gateway allows for a common method of routing packets of information between one network and the next. So essentially, you can have a gateway, all right, of a network which is passing via a coaxial cable. All right. Obviously, that means that you have two devices which are connected together using a coaxial cable. but then the next leg of the journey might be connected via a fiber optic cable. All right, so you'll have these two devices connected via fiber optic cable. So you'll have gateways uh, using a fiber optic connection. You might have a system which is using satellite. So in that case, you would
How
be
long?
using that other form of gateway, and so on and so forth. Essentially, the more you connect one network to the next, all right, um, the more you're going to allow for communication between obviously these different computers, and essentially you're creating what is known as an inter-network, or what we like to simplify and call it as an internet. Notice an internet, small I. All right, because an internet, any internet, all right, is uh, when you have multiple networks connected together. All right. Um, um, Now, um, uh,
Job. You'll
essentially,
be fine.
all right, when we look back a little bit in history, all right, of the different types of internet that exists, all right, the first original form of an internet work was known as a catenet, all right, categorically network, all right. And the most notable example of internet working is essentially the internet that we know and love. Now, as you can imagine, the internet has a number of different technologies which are working on the same network. You have a number of different devices, but somehow they're all communicating with each other in a harmonious way. How is this possible? Well, this is possible for the simple reason that each and every one of these devices is making use, all right, of a protocol, all right, which is a standard which has been agreed upon, all right, by by all manufacturers, all right, of network communication hardware, which is referred as the TCP/IP protocol. All right, essentially, all right, irrespective of what hardware technologies is actually being used underneath in order to transfer data from point A to point B, underneath they are making use of the TCP/IP connection, all right, or TCP/IP protocol in order to help that communication along. Essentially, um, what the TCP/IP protocol allows us to do is it provides a a series of steps, all right, that are required in order to transfer a packet from its source to its location via these different gateways, all right, and it sort of like separates the data itself from the means of transmission, okay, therefore making it versatile, all right, across different technologies, okay, even if you're using older technologies, all right. So as long as your device is making use of the TCP/IP protocol, all right, then you will be able to connect to the internet, all right. One of the very first networks that was connected together was known, or the first inter-networks that was actually connected together was known as the ARPANET. All right, the ARPANET was actually one of the very first networks that was developed in order to well, there's no really nice way of putting it, to secure communication, all right, between major um, uh, major elements within the American defense industry in the case of nuclear annihilation, essentially. All right. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to make sure that it was actually possible for one branch of the military to communicate with another um, uh, without it being taken out completely just by taking out a particular node. All right. So essentially, that is why it was developed. However, that same idea was in turn used, all right, um, uh, in order to develop the internet that we know and love today. So nowadays, most of the gateways that we use in order to connect to the internet are handled by what we know as routers. All right. So, what is this TCP/IP protocol? Well, essentially, this TCP/IP protocol is an international standard that has been agreed upon, all right, and set by the Internet Protocol Suite in order to serve all of these different uh, communications worldwide. Essentially, um, a network consists of of um, uh, the internet as we know is a network that consists of multiple hundreds if not millions of different other networks which range the gamut from being public, private, all right, for business, for academic reasons, um, for governments, and so on and so forth. And even the size of each and every one of the networks that we're talking about being connected to each other vary very much so in terms of their topology, in terms of their scope, and in terms of the way that they are actually physically linked together. All right. The TCP/IP protocol allows us, all right, to abstract away the physical way that these devices are actually connected to each other. This, in turn, makes it easier for us to use the internet, all right, in order to do anything that has to do with regards to to telecommunications. All right, so we're talking telephony, watching movies, listening to music, watching television. All of this has been reshaped and redefined by the internet. All right. Um, so essentially, it is very, very, very interesting to see how the internet was actually formed, and I would highly suggest that you take a little bit of a look. All right, as a bit of homework, if you will, to this YouTube video over here, which showcases, all right, way how the internet sort of like evolved. Okay, um, so the, the 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 real beauty behind the internet is that essentially the internet itself is not governed by a single um, uh, state, or it is not also implemented using one technological implementation. All right, all of the what the internet is made up of is literally, all right, uh, the um, uh, the connection of these different networks together, each and every one of these networks making use of their own standards, all right, which makes it a lot more um, uh, robust. This link over here basically showcases a short history, all right, of what actually went along, all right, and how the idea of first and foremost, networking computers came about, and how, in turn, um, computers started becoming connected into networks, and how networks then needed to be connected to other networks, and eventually reaching what we know as the internet that we all know and love today. So, if you actually had to map out the internet, all right, it literally look somewhat like a galaxy, if you will, and you are somewhere, all right, small speck on a small branch, all right, on a small another small sub branch, all right, connecting you to literally the rest of the world, all right, which is quite interesting and quite fascinating if you think about it. So, what is really the difference between the internet, as we just described, and the World Wide Web? What is the World Wide Web? What's the difference? Any idea?
Could it be that one of them is just a section of the other? Like, for example, we have like there's the dark web, there's different layers that maybe it is not accessible to the lay person using the internet.
Not exactly. www in terms of for domains, yeah, there or thereabouts. Yes. What do what does the term www for domains? What um why are domains important, Bridget?
To connect to something in particular, like a telephone number on the internet, you're dialing something, certain IP address.
Okay, all right. So we're getting there. So essentially, all right, the difference between the internet and the World Wide Web is that the internet is literally the network of networks that are connected together. All right, so it's essentially talking about how different networks are connected to each other physically. All right, all right. The World Wide Web, on the other hand, refers to the services that one can can access over the internet. All right, we use links, we use hyperlinks, we use URLs, we use all form of other forms of resources in order to be able to make use of different systems. All right, and different services essentially. Okay, in lay speak, all right, the internet and the World Wide Web, all right, are essentially the same thing. All right. However, we as computer scientists need to be able to differentiate between the two. Okay. So when we talk about the internet, we're literally talking about how different um, uh, hardware networks are connected to yet other networks. All right. Whereas the World Wide Web refers to the services that are provided on this platform, essentially. Okay. All right. So, um, uh, have you ever heard of the term peer-to-peer or the term client-server? What do those mean?
Familiar names, but that's it.
Okay. So let's start off from a very basic point of view. All right. Client and server. All right. Even if you have no idea as to what they are in terms of computing. What do those words mean? All right. What does that sort of like what does that what do those terms um, uh, give you in terms of an understanding in your line of thought?
Sir, I think it's a device or something that serves the client.
All right. So, can you give me an example of everyday life where you have a sort of like a client server relationship?
At the moment, I cannot give you an example.
Restaurant.
A restaurant, very good. Or a shop. Okay.
Okay.
So, a shop is acting like a server. Why? The shop doesn't go around to its clients. On the other hand, it waits for the clients to come to it. Do you understand this idea? All right. So essentially, the server is there to provide a service. Okay. And it will wait for clients to come to it. All right. And it will be able to accept their service and help them out with whatever they require, essentially. All right. Obviously, it can only provide a service for things that it actually has on offer. So, just like a shop might, let's say, a grocery shop. All right. If a grocery shop doesn't have a particular ingredient or a particular product, all right, it cannot sell you that product, all right. So, in a very similar fashion, a computer which is acting as a server can only provide you service for the services that it has uh, that it has available. Okay, peer to peer. All right. If you think about the term peer, peer means individual. All right. Peer to peer means from individual to individual. All right. So essentially, there isn't really a client server relationship. All right. In this case, who is the client and who is the server depends on the interaction that is happening between these two peers. All right. So let me give you an example of a peer-to-peer service. Have you guys ever heard of the the service called um, what was it called? Um, uh, oof.
LimeWire or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yes, I was going for the very first one.
Napster.
Napster. That's it. Napster. Yes. Have you ever heard of Napster?
Yeah, I never used it.
You never
Heard
used
of
it.
it before. I've heard of it before, but I never used it.
Do you know how it worked?
Basically, you could share, for example, a file, normally music.
Okay. So essentially, Napster was
Someone can download it, no?
it first and foremost it was um we're talking about the very early days of the internet. Okay. So essentially, um uh, the um the idea was that anybody who downloaded this Napster application allowed themselves to be able to share their files with other people. All right. So, and in fact, yes, predominantly it was used for music at the time. All right, that we're talking here. Multimedia just became a thing in computing, and the multimedia that was suitable to be transmitted on the internet, given the slow internet speeds at the time, all right, was audio, not video, all right. So YouTube wasn't even a thing back then. So what happened? What happened was that a lot of people basically were able to share their music with other people's music. So if, for example, I wanted to listen to Metallica and I only had a couple of songs of Metallica, I could share my couple of songs. However, somebody else who might have had another couple of songs, I would be able to download it from then, and so on and so forth. Obviously, there was no um, server in the sense that there was a computer which was dedicated in order to sharing these devices. In a sense, if you were connected to the internet, you were acting as a server if somebody wanted your file, and you were acting as a client if you were downloading a file, essentially. All right. However, this Napster idea, all right, was the thing, all right, was the catalyst, if you will, that spurred on a number of different developments. You have the development of um, um, the you have the development of piracy, internet piracy. All right, because essentially, when you were actually sharing one file for another, which was free, all right, you were cutting out the middleman. Essentially, you were stealing from the artists. Um, uh, it led to the idea of um, uh, of streaming services, all right, or buying individual songs, all right. So um, inadvertently, this idea of Napster also paved the way to the idea of the iPod and iTunes, all right, because people didn't want to actually buy an entire album in order to be able to listen to a particular song. They just wanted that one song. All right. And it also paved the way for streaming services that we see nowadays with Spotify and Amazon and what have you. All right. It's a very, very interesting story. There was actually a documentary about that, which, if I can find it, let me see if I can actually find it very, very quickly. I'll share it with you in the chat. It is one of the most interesting stories about the internet. Um, um, right. There was um, uh, there was at one point a video that was on the Discovery Channel at one point. Um, no, I'll find it. I'll send you a link to it. Um, yeah, this is basically the story of Napster. Here you go. Watch that. It's actually quite interesting. Okay. Not that long. At least you'll be able to get a better understanding as to how this sort of like paved the way for for these um, uh, for these new um, elements, essentially. Okay. So yes, we talked about the client server. All right. Usually, the difference between the client server is that a server would have a dedicated service which it would actually provide. All right. So a dedicated server would have sort of like um, um, one particular scope. Think of it like, I don't know, whenever you're accessing your Gmail account, all right, you're using an email exchange server, all right, in order to be able to access your emails and send emails to other people. You might use a program on your own machine, but that program in turn is probably communicating with these servers in order to be able to send and receive messages um, um, from one computer to the next. That is essentially the idea of a client server, and obviously that is but one example. All right. If you are logging into your bank accounts, all right, that is a financial server. If you're playing a game, for example, online, okay, um, um, that would be a game server. If you are downloading a file from a website, you'd be using a file server, and so on and so forth. All right, all of these different types of computers which act as the main go-between. All right, and they would carry out the requests performed or asked by the client. All right. However, peer-to-peer, all right, or P2P, all right, for short, is where you'd have um, uh, individual nodes on a network which can act as either the server or the client, or the server and the client at the same time, all right, in order to be able to share resources across that network. Essentially, what peers do they would section off a portion of their resources and processing power and disk storage and bandwidth, all right, in order to act or to help, all right, with the communication across that network, essentially. All right. So essentially, peers in this peer-to-peer network act as both suppliers and as consumers of these resources, all right, at any given point in time. All right. So essentially, this form of technology led to all of these other forms of technology that we talked about. Even the idea of torrenting is another idea of peer-to-peer computing, essentially. All right. So what you're really doing is you're removing the centralized server. All right, and this is why it's so hard for uh, for one to be able to stop these pirating websites at the end of the day, because if it has spread, all right, if your file that you didn't want to be made available has spread to two, three, four, five individuals, people, um, eventually it will take time in order to stop each and every individual. All right, so um, uh, there are ways and means of controlling it, of combating it, and one of the ways of doing that is making such data and such elements easier to access and more freely available, and maybe not as expensive, because people would tend to um, err towards the side of convenience. All right. So if it is convenient and not expensive and available, all right, then people would tend to gravitate towards it. All right. Another form of technology that also is used, all right, within networking is the idea of network segmentation. Why do we need it? Well, sometimes as lands tend to grow, all right, if they grow um, in the same using the same structure, then essentially what you're ending up doing is you're going to cause more traffic congestion, all right, and it starts creating problems. Think of it like this: if you have a road, all right, and you start putting smaller roads feeding into this road, all right, then it means that you're going to have a number of different uh, vehicles joining that road from different angles. The more roads that join this initial road, the more roads joining this initial road, the more congestion you're going to create. All right. So essentially, what you sometimes need to do, all right, is you need to create what are known as network segments, all right, i.e., you would take different nodes of a network and you would tend to group them together because they would tend um, uh, to uh, to communicate more with each other. So essentially, what you would do is you would um, uh, divide the network into smaller sub networks. You would connect those devices which tend to communicate with each other a lot together. Okay, therefore reducing the number of stops and hops that they would actually need, and stopping them from congesting the rest of the network. All right, and then you might connect them to a backbone, if you will, in order to ease congestion. Essentially, you would do this through the use of a number of bridges or switches or hubs in order to create these different segments of your network. All right. You could also do this not only just for improvement of quality of service, but also in relation to security. All right. Okay. And reliability. So this would be an example. All right. So let's say you have a central bridge here. All right. And you have these devices which are communicating with each other, these devices which are communicating with each other, and these devices communicating with each other, and all of them um, being linked to a link. Well, what you could do is you could separate them, all right? So each segment would have its own dedicated bridge, all right, in order to be able to ease communication between those devices. And then in turn, these bridges will then be connected to a backbone of the network, all right, in order to ease congestion between the communications that are happening between these devices um, uh, between themselves versus communications that are happening across different segments. Right. So this uh, this system here would prove to be probably a lot more reliable, a lot faster. All right, and a lot more secure than something as simple as this. Is this clear, guys?
Perhaps what isn't so clear from my end, what is the bridge
The bridge
exactly?
would be a router. A bridge is a router, essentially.
Oh, okay, all right, okay.
Okay, so imagine you had a router, and all of these devices were connected to a single router. All right. Then essentially, if you had a number of a high level of communication happening between these computers here, all right, in this segment, these here and these here between themselves, and then you wanted to also have communication across segments, then essentially what you're doing is you're putting a lot of pressure on this bridge,
Alright, alright, alright. It's
right, or
understood.
this
Okay.
on this router. So over here, what we're saying is let these segments be able to communicate with each other via this hub, and then this hub will communicate with these other segments via other hubs over a backbone. Okay.
Understood. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Right. So, last thing that we're going to be talking about today is the idea of a VPN. I know that we'll have skipped over a little bit in time, but hopefully we'll be able to stop here today. Essentially, a VPN is the idea of having a virtual private network, all right, which allows one to communicate, make use of the public telecommunication infrastructure. However, they would be able to communicate in a more secure fashion, all right, as though they had a secure and personal line. Essentially, the idea of a VPN is to be able to reduce the cost, all right, of secure connections, all right, by encapsulating two or more networked devices, okay, um, and communicating over a very secure tunnel, um, thus making communication more secure. Essentially, you'd have one computer passing through a firewall, through a modem, through a VPN tunnel to your counterpart, which will be able to then communicate back. Essentially, this secure tunnel will make it a lot more secure and a lot more or less susceptible to interception by other elements or more dangerous elements over the internet. What I wanted to do also was I wanted to share with you this video, which let me just find it here, so that you'll be able to see what VPN is and how it actually works. Okay, so that you'll be able to understand it a little bit more. Okay, and that brings us to a connection to a conclusion for this set of slides as well. All right. So thank you very much for listening. I hope this lesson was interesting to you. I will see you guys in for our next session. All right. And have a good rest of your day. All right. Happy Valentine's Day. All right. And again, sorry for stepping over my time.
You messed up our dates, sir.
I have my wife here as well, so.
It's an advantage.
Anyway, see you.
Thanks a lot.
See you, sir. Have a nice evening.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.